I never thought I'd be the kind of man to start second-guessing his wife's every move. But there I was, sitting in my office at the firm, staring blankly at the spreadsheet in front of me. My focus was shot, my thoughts drifting back to Peggy. Peggy and I met in college, just two kids fumbling through life, trying to make something of ourselves. She was vibrant, a firecracker with a wit that could slice through steel, and a smile that could light up the darkest room. I fell hard and fast. We married 2 years after graduation, our dreams aligned like stars in a constellation. She went into marketing, and I pursued a career in finance. We were supposed to be the perfect couple, the kind who had it all figured out. But lately, things felt different. Distant. Peggy had always been a social butterfly, but in the past few months, her schedule seemed to be filled with more girls' nights and work events than I could count. Her phone became a permanent fixture in her hand, always tilted away from me, her face lighting up with those secretive smiles that made my stomach churn with unease. It wasn't just the phone. It was everything. The way she'd suddenly close her laptop when I walked into the room, or the hurried way she'd change the subject when I asked about her day. I noticed the new clothes, too, the dresses and shoes she never wore around me but somehow needed for her work functions. I told myself I was overreacting. Work had been stressful, and maybe I was projecting my frustrations onto her. But then there was that day, the day that planted the seed of suspicion so deep in my mind it took root. I had come home early from the office, hoping to surprise Peggy with dinner. I wanted to make up for the last few weeks of late nights, long hours, and our widening distance. I approached the front door quietly, trying to catch her off guard with a smile, maybe a laugh. But when I stopped at the window, I froze. I heard her whispering in the living room, her voice low and conspiratorial, like she didn't want to be overheard. "You know, Hannah, I could use a little flirtation on the side. Life with Ben has become so boring." Hannah, her best friend, let out a soft laugh. "Have an affair, Peg. No one will ever know." I stood there, frozen, feeling the blood drain from my face. A cold wave washed over me, and I clenched my fists, my breath caught somewhere between my lungs and my throat. Peggy's words echoed in my mind over and over, a litany of doubt and betrayal. "You don't know?" I whispered under my breath, my voice hoarse and trembling. "Well, let's see who turns out to be a fool now." The words replayed in my head for days after. My world felt like it was tilting, spinning out of control, and I had no idea how to stop it. Peggy hadn't seen me that day, and I hadn't confronted her. I couldn't. Not yet. Instead, I watched. I listened. I waited. I needed more than just a feeling, more than just words whispered between friends. At least, that's what I told myself. Inside, I was already breaking. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to Peggy's slow, steady breathing beside me. I wanted to believe she was dreaming of us, of our future, of the plans we'd made, but doubt crept in, snaking its way through my thoughts like a cold wind, chilling me to the bone. Every time her breath caught or she shifted in her sleep, I felt my muscles tense, waiting, wondering what was going through her mind. Was she thinking of me, or was it someone else? Morning came, and Peggy slipped out of bed earlier than usual. I watched her from the corner of my eye as she moved quietly around the room, gathering her clothes and her things. She didn't notice I was awake. Her face was thoughtful, almost distant, as if she were a million miles away. When she finally glanced back at me, her expression changed to that bright, cheerful mask she wore so well. "Morning, love," she chirped, a little too bright, a little too forced. "I have a busy day ahead. Meeting with a new client, then lunch with Hannah. I'll probably be back late." I nodded, feeling a strange numbness settling over me. "Busy week for you," I murmured, trying to keep my voice steady. She smiled and shrugged. slipping into her routine as if nothing had changed. You know how it is. Gotta keep the clients happy. But I wasn't a client. I was her husband. I should have been the one she was trying to keep happy. The day dragged on slowly. I went to the office trying to bury myself in numbers and reports, but my mind was somewhere else. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something had shifted irreparably between us. My coworkers noticed my distraction. They asked if I was okay, if something was on my mind, but I just waved them off, pretending everything was fine. I didn't want to talk about it, not yet. When I got home, Peggy wasn't there. Her car wasn't in the driveway. I checked the time, 7 p.m. I walked into the house feeling that same chill, that same gnawing suspicion that had gripped me ever since I heard her whispering to Hannah. The house was too quiet, too still, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I poured myself a drink and sat down in the living room, staring at the front door, waiting for her to come home. I kept thinking about the last few months, replaying every conversation, every laugh, every moment of intimacy, searching for signs I'd missed. There were plenty. I remembered the way she would sometimes stare off into the distance when we talked, her mind clearly somewhere else. The way she'd pull away from my touch, her smile a little too tight, her laugh a little too forced. The way she seemed to be hiding something, always a step ahead of my questions, always deflecting with a joke or a story that went nowhere. I felt like I'd been living with a stranger, like I didn't know this woman at all. Around 9 p.m., she finally walked through the door. Her hair was slightly tousled, and she had a glow about her, a flush in her cheeks that I hadn't seen in a long time. I stood up, my heart thumping in my chest. "Hey," she said, smiling, setting her purse down by the door. "Sorry I'm late. Things ran longer than I expected." "Where were you?" I asked, my voice sounding harder than I intended. She blinked, taken aback by the edge in my tone. "I told you. I had lunch with Hannah and then we just ended up talking for a while. You know how it is." I nodded slowly, my eyes searching hers for some hint, some flicker of guilt or a lie. But she held my gaze, steady and confident, as if daring me to challenge her. I forced a smile, trying to mask the turmoil inside me. "Yeah, of course. Just missed you, that's all." She softened at that, stepping closer, reaching up to touch my cheek. "Missed you too," she murmured, leaning in to kiss me. Her lips were warm, soft, but I felt nothing. No spark, no connection, just an emptiness that spread like a dark stain through my chest. I pulled back, forcing another smile. "I'll go start dinner," I said, turning away before she could see the doubt in my eyes. That night, I watched her closely. She was more attentive than usual, asking me about my day, my work, laughing at my jokes. But it all felt like a performance, like she was trying too hard to be the Peggy I remembered, the Peggy I loved. And I hated it. I hated the uncertainty, the way I questioned every word, every gesture. I hated myself for doubting her. But deep down, I knew. I knew something was wrong, and I knew I had to find out the truth. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to Peggy's slow, steady breathing beside me. I wanted to believe she was dreaming of us, of our future, of the plans we'd made. But doubt crept in, snaking its way through my thoughts like a cold wind, chilling me to the bone. Every time her breath caught or she shifted in her sleep, I felt my muscles tense, waiting, wondering what was going through her mind. Was she thinking of me, or was it someone else? Morning came, and Peggy slipped out of bed earlier than usual. I watched her from the corner of my eye as she moved quietly around the room, gathering her clothes and her things. She didn't notice I was awake. Her face was thoughtful, almost distant, as if she were a million miles away. When she finally glanced back at me, her expression changed to that bright, cheerful mask she wore so well. "Morning, love," she chirped, a little too bright, a little too forced. I have a busy day ahead, meeting with a new client, then lunch with Hannah. I'll probably be back late. I nodded, feeling a strange numbness settling over me. Busy week for you? I murmured, trying to keep my voice steady. She smiled and shrugged, slipping into her routine as if nothing had changed. You know how it is. Gotta keep the clients happy. But I wasn't a client. I was her husband. I should have been the one she was trying to keep happy. The day dragged on slowly. I went to the office trying to bury myself in numbers and reports, but my mind was somewhere else. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something had shifted irreparably between us. My co-workers noticed my distraction. They asked if I was okay, if something was on my mind, but I just waved them off, pretending everything was fine. I didn't want to talk about it, not yet. When I got home, Peggy wasn't there. Her car wasn't in the driveway. I checked the time, 7 p.m. I walked into the house, feeling that same chill, that same gnawing suspicion that had gripped me ever since I heard her whispering to Hannah. The house was too quiet, too still, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I poured myself a drink and sat down in the living room, staring at the front door, waiting for her to come home. I kept thinking about the last few months, replaying every conversation, every laugh, every moment of intimacy, searching for signs I'd missed. There were plenty. I remembered the way she would sometimes stare off into the distance when we talked, her mind clearly somewhere else. The way she'd pull away from my touch, her smile a little too tight, her laugh a little too forced. The way she seemed to be hiding something, always a step ahead of my questions, always deflecting with a joke or a story that went nowhere. I felt like I'd been living with a stranger, like I didn't know this woman at all. Around 9 p.m., she finally walked through the door. Her hair was slightly tousled, and she had a glow about her, a flush in her cheeks that I hadn't seen in a long time. I stood up, my heart thumping in my chest. "Hey," she said, smiling, setting her purse down by the door. "Sorry I'm late. Things ran longer than I expected." "Where were you?" I asked, my voice sounding harder than I intended. She blinked, taken aback by the edge in my tone. "I told you, I had lunch with Hannah and then we just ended up talking for a while. You know how it is." I nodded slowly, my eyes searching hers for some hint, some flicker of guilt or a lie. But she held my gaze, steady and confident, as if daring me to challenge her. I forced a smile, trying to mask the turmoil inside me. "Yeah, of course. Just missed you, that's all." She softened at that, stepping closer, reaching up to touch my cheek. "Missed you too," she murmured, leaning in to kiss me. Her lips were warm, soft, but I felt nothing. No spark, no connection, just an emptiness that spread like a dark stain through my chest. I pulled back, forcing another smile. "I'll go start dinner," I said, turning away before she could see the doubt in my eyes. That night, I watched her closely. She was more attentive than usual, asking me about my day, my work, laughing at my jokes. But it all felt like a performance, like she was trying too hard to be the Peggy I remembered, the Peggy I loved. And I hated it. I hated the uncertainty, the way I questioned every word, every gesture. I hated myself for doubting her, but deep down, I knew. I knew something was wrong, and I knew I had to find out the truth. You said, next part. ChatGPT said, part 3, discovery. The days that followed felt like an eternity, a blur of suspicion and doubt. I couldn't concentrate at work, couldn't sleep at night. I became an actor in my own life, pretending everything was normal, all the while feeling like I was living on a knife's edge. Peggy remained the same, or at least she pretended to be. She kept up her routine of work, social events, and occasional late nights, but every time she walked out the door, I felt a piece of me walk out with her. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't go on like this, living in the dark, questioning every word she said, every move she made. I needed proof. I needed to know for sure if I was being paranoid or if there was something more, something darker, lurking beneath the surface of our marriage. I decided to follow her. It felt ridiculous at first, like something out of a bad detective novel, but I convinced myself it was the only way. One Tuesday afternoon, I told Peggy I had a late meeting and would be home late. She seemed unfazed, barely glancing up from her phone as she nodded, her fingers tapping out a quick text. I waited until she left for her work event, and then I slipped out behind her, keeping my distance as I trailed her car through the city streets. She drove to a part of town we rarely visited, a quiet, affluent area with tree-lined streets and big, expensive houses. I felt my pulse quicken as I watched her pull into the driveway of a large, modern home. She parked her car and stepped out, smoothing her dress, glancing around as if checking to see if anyone was watching. I ducked down, my heart pounding in my chest. She walked to the front door, hesitated for a moment, then knocked softly. A man answered, tall and well-dressed, with a broad smile and a confident stance. He leaned down, kissed her on the cheek. No, it wasn't just a kiss on the cheek. It was intimate, lingering, the kind of kiss you give to someone you're more than just friends with. She laughed softly, a sound I hadn't heard in months, and they disappeared inside, the door closing behind them. I felt like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles turned white. I stared at the house, my mind racing, 1,000 thoughts colliding and crashing into one another. I knew I should leave, drive away, pretend I hadn't seen anything. But I couldn't. I needed to know more. I needed to see what was happening inside. I got out of the car, moving as quietly as I could, staying in the shadows. My heart hammered in my chest with each step I took toward the house. I crept around the side, looking for a window. I felt like a criminal, a trespasser in my own life, but I didn't care. I had to know. I found a window, slightly open, with a sheer curtain drawn across it. I could hear voices, hers and his, low, intimate, like they were sharing secrets I was never meant to hear. I crouched down, inching closer, my breath shallow and fast. Then I heard it, her voice, clear as day, cutting through the quiet of the night. God, I've missed this, Peggy murmured, her tone soft, sensual. Missed you. I couldn't see them yet, but I could hear the sound of their movements, a rustle of fabric, the creak of furniture shifting. I swallowed hard, feeling a cold sweat break out across my forehead. Me too, the man replied, his voice thick with desire. You have no idea. There was a soft laugh, hers, followed by a sound that tore through me like a knife. The unmistakable sound of a kiss, deep, passionate, the kind we hadn't shared in far too long. I crept closer, peering through the small gap in the curtain. There they were, on a couch, bodies entwined, hands exploring, mouths meeting in a frenzy of lust. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, unable to look away. His hands moved over her body with a familiarity that made my stomach turn. Her head tipped back, eyes closed, lips parted in a way I hadn't seen in years. I felt the ground sway beneath me, the weight of what I was seeing crashing down on me with brutal force. It wasn't just a fling, it was more. The way she moved, the way she moaned softly into his mouth. This wasn't new, this was something they'd done before. Many times. My stomach clenched as I realized the full extent of her betrayal. My wife wasn't just bored, she was in love, or at least in lust, with another man. The laughter, the whispered conversations, the late nights, everything began to make sense. It all clicked into place, a cruel puzzle I hadn't even realized I was piecing together. And I just stood there, frozen, watching my wife in another man's arms. My heart shattered into a million pieces, but I couldn't look away. I needed to see it all, feel it all, let it consume me so there would be no doubt left, no room for denial. I felt a wave of nausea rise in my throat. I turned away from the window, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The cold night air hit me like a slap in the face, and I stumbled back to my car, my mind reeling. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, my knuckles white, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might burst from my chest. I knew I couldn't confront her. Not yet. I needed time to think, to plan, to decide what I was going to do. But one thing was clear. Peggy had betrayed me, and I wasn't going to let it go. Not without a fight. I drove home in a daze, the streets passing by in a blur of headlights and shadows. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, each one more painful than the last. I tried to keep my hands steady on the wheel, but they were trembling, my knuckles still white with tension. I replayed what I'd seen over and over, each memory a jagged shard of glass cutting deeper into my heart. By the time I pulled into our driveway, the numbness had turned into something else, something darker, something raw and primal. Rage, cold and fierce, settled into my bones. I killed the engine and sat there for a long moment, staring at the house, our home. The place where we'd built a life together, a life I thought was real. Now it felt like a mockery, a facade hiding the truth of what lay beneath. When I finally walked inside, the house was dark and quiet. Peggy wasn't home yet. Of course not. She was still with him, wrapped up in her little fantasy, forgetting about me, forgetting about everything we'd built. I walked through the rooms in the dark, feeling like a ghost in my own home, my footsteps echoing off the walls. The emptiness swallowed me whole. I went to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed, my thoughts spiraling. I needed to do something, anything, to regain control of my life. But what? Confront her? Demand answers? Scream at her until the truth came out? No, that wouldn't be enough. Not for this. Not for what she'd done to me. I needed a plan. Something precise. Something that would make her feel what I was feeling. I wanted her to hurt, to see the pain she'd caused. I wanted her to understand that there were consequences for betraying me like this. I grabbed my phone and stared at it for a long moment, my thumb hovering over the screen. I could call her right now, demand she come home, force a confrontation. But I stopped myself. No, that wasn't the right move. Not yet. I needed to be smarter than that. I needed to be patient. I needed to gather my strength, my resolve. Then an idea began to form in my mind, slow at first, but growing clearer with each passing second. I knew what I had to do. I needed to know more about him. I needed to find out who this man was, what he meant to her, how deep this betrayal ran. I wasn't going to confront her blindly. I was going to make sure I had all the facts, every piece of the puzzle, before I made my move. I took a deep breath and began searching through Peggy's things. I felt like a spy, rifling through her drawers, her papers, looking for any clue, any scrap of evidence. Her laptop was password protected, of course, but her phone was right there, plugged into the charger by the bed. She must have forgotten it in her rush to meet him. My heart pounded as I picked it up, my hands shaking. I knew this was a line I was crossing, that there was no going back. But I didn't care. Not anymore. I tapped the screen, and to my surprise, it opened without a passcode. She'd always been careless like that, too trusting, too sure of herself. I went straight to her messages, scrolling through the endless conversations with friends, colleagues, until I found what I was looking for. His name, James. The text thread was buried under dozens of other messages, but there it was, clear as day. I felt a sick thrill run through me as I opened it, my eyes scanning the words quickly, devouring them like a starving man. Can't wait to see you tonight. I've missed you so much. Can't stop thinking about last time. Are you sure he doesn't suspect anything? I felt my breath catch in my throat as I read each message, each little piece of their secret world. The way they talked to each other, the familiarity, the intimacy. It made my skin crawl. I kept scrolling, my jaw clenched, until I saw the pictures. Selfies, smiling and happy, her head resting on his shoulder, their faces close, too close. A picture of them in what looked like a hotel room, her wearing nothing but a bedsheet, her hair tousled and wild. I felt a hot flush of rage course through me, my hand shaking as I swiped through the images. She looked different with him, younger, freer, like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. I felt a sharp stab of jealousy, not just because of him, but because she had something with him she'd never had with me. I threw the phone down, my breathing heavy. I felt sick to my stomach, my head pounding with anger and disbelief. I had what I needed. I knew his name. I knew what he looked like. I had the evidence. Now, it was time to use it. I stayed up late that night, unable to sleep, my mind racing with plans, ideas, scenarios. I knew I had to be careful. I couldn't just confront them without a strategy. I needed to find out more about James, where he worked, what kind of man he was. I needed to dig deeper, find his weaknesses, his flaws, and then use them against him. The next day, I took off work and began my investigation. I started with his social media, profiles filled with photos of him looking perfect, charming, the kind of man who seemed to have it all. But I knew better. I could see through the facade. I would find his cracks, his vulnerabilities, and when I did, I would exploit them. I wasn't going to be the fool in this story, not anymore. I was going to make them pay, both of them, and I wasn't going to rest until I did. I spent the next few days obsessed, consumed by the need to uncover everything I could about James. My life outside of this twisted investigation became a blur. I went through the motions at work, nodding and smiling when required, but my thoughts were always somewhere else. The few times I was home, Peggy didn't seem to notice my distraction, too absorbed in her own secret life. It was a strange relief, not having to pretend with her, knowing that every word she spoke was another lie. James wasn't hard to find. Social media gave away more than he probably intended. Photos from business trips, snapshots of him at company events, updates that painted a picture of a man who thrived on attention and admiration. He worked in advertising, just like Peggy. No wonder they'd hit it off. They were both masters of spin, of crafting stories that sounded good but meant nothing. I dug deeper, looking for clues that could tell me more about his life outside the digital image he projected. I needed to know where he spent his time, who he saw, what he valued. The more I learned, the more I realized he was exactly the kind of man I hated. Smug, arrogant, too sure of himself, convinced the world revolved around his charm. I knew I needed more. I couldn't just rely on the internet to give me what I needed. I had to get closer, find a way into his life. So, I decided to visit his workplace. I knew where it was from one of his posts. Some sleek, modern office downtown, the kind of place where people pretended their work mattered more than it did. I took the afternoon off, dressed in something that would let me blend in, and headed there, my heart pounding with anticipation. When I got there, I lingered outside, pretending to be on the phone, watching the entrance, scanning the faces that came and went. I didn't have to wait long. He came out around 2 p.m., laughing with a group of colleagues looking every bit the charming executive. I followed at a distance, watching as he walked to a nearby coffee shop, his confident swagger making my blood boil. I waited for him to settle in with his coffee, pretending to check my phone, glancing up every few seconds to make sure I didn't lose him. I felt a strange, electric thrill as I watched him from the corner of my eye. He had no idea I was there, no idea I was watching, waiting. When he finally got up and left, I slipped into the coffee shop, approaching the barista with a friendly smile. "Hey, I was supposed to meet a friend here," I said casually, gesturing to where James had been sitting. Tall guy, dark hair, a bit of a show-off. Did you happen to catch his name? The barista chuckled. "Yeah, that's James. He comes in here all the time, talks a lot. You're lucky he didn't keep you waiting. He can be a bit of a talker. I smiled, thanking her for the information, and left the shop, my mind buzzing with the possibilities. I had confirmation. This was his place, his routine. Now I knew where to find him. Over the next few days, I followed James whenever I could, tracking his movements, learning his habits. I became a shadow, always one step behind, always watching. I found out where he lived, a nice condo in a fancy part of town, far too expensive for someone in his position. I started to notice the small things, the details that would have gone unnoticed by anyone who wasn't looking closely. He had a routine, a pattern. He went to the same gym every morning, worked late most evenings, always had dinner at the same bar on Fridays. He had a girlfriend, too, a blonde woman named Melissa, who looked at him like he was the sun. I felt a twisted sense of satisfaction knowing Peggy wasn't his only secret, that she was just another notch on his belt. I decided it was time to take the next step. I wasn't going to confront him directly, not yet, but I needed to rattle his cage, to make him feel the same paranoia that had gripped me for weeks. One night, after he left the office late, I followed him to his condo and waited until he went inside. I'd already checked his car, noting the make, model, and license plate. I had a plan. I waited for the light in his window to go dark, then I crept over to his car. I pulled a small, sharp knife from my pocket and knelt down, feeling a grim satisfaction as I drove the blade into his front tire, slashing it wide open. The hiss of air escaping was like music to my ears. I stepped back, looking up at his dark window, imagining his face when he found his car the next morning. A small taste of the chaos I was about to bring into his life. It wasn't enough, but it was a start. I knew I had to keep pushing, keep digging. I wanted to know more about his life, his secrets, the skeletons he had buried. I wanted him to feel exposed, vulnerable, just like I did. I started leaving anonymous notes on his car, small scraps of paper with cryptic messages like, "I know what you're doing," and "Your secret isn't safe." I imagined him finding those notes, his brow furrowing, doubt creeping into his mind. Was it his girlfriend who knew? A jealous coworker? His boss? I wanted him to be on edge, to start looking over his shoulder, wondering who was watching, who was waiting. And it worked. I saw it in the way he moved, the nervous glances, the phone calls he made in hushed tones when he thought no one was listening. I saw him checking his car every morning, walking around it, looking for signs, for clues. He was starting to crack, just like I wanted. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. I wanted to push him further, to break him down completely. I wanted him to suffer. I wanted them both to suffer. I knew I had to get closer to him, closer than I'd ever been. I needed to find out who he really was, to find the one thing that would shatter his world just like he had shattered mine. And when I found it, I knew I would finally have my revenge. The days bled into one another, each one more exhausting than the last. My head was filled with a buzzing tension that never seemed to leave, a constant hum of anger and betrayal. I was consumed with thoughts of James and Peggy, how they laughed, how they touched, how they lived this secret life that I was only just beginning to uncover. I could barely think of anything else, but as my obsession grew, so did my determination. I knew I was getting closer to finding the piece of information that would bring it all crashing down. I decided it was time to push harder. The notes had shaken James, but I needed something more. I needed to see him face to face. So, I waited until Friday, his favorite day, his usual routine. He would be at the bar he frequented after work, throwing back drinks with his coworkers, feeling invincible. I'd seen it too many times now to know it by heart. I showed up early, blending in with the crowd, nursing a drink at the far end of the bar where I could watch him without being seen. I felt a thrill of anticipation, the adrenaline coursing through my veins. My hands were steady, my heart a drumbeat in my chest. I watched as he walked in, a smug smile on his face, greeting the bartender like an old friend. He was everything I hated, so sure of himself, so oblivious to the storm brewing around him. He took his usual seat and ordered his usual drink, chatting with the bartender and flashing that easy grin. I watched him closely, memorizing every detail, every expression. I waited until he'd finished his first drink and was halfway through his second. Then, I made my move. I stood up, walking over to his side of the bar, my steps purposeful, my eyes locked on him. As I approached, I saw him glance up, his smile faltering slightly as he sensed my presence. I could see the moment recognition flickered in his eyes, a slight narrowing, a hint of confusion. "James," I said, feigning a casual tone. "Mind if I join you?" He blinked, clearly taken aback. Do I know you?" His voice was steady, but there was an edge of caution in it. I smiled tightly, feeling the tension thrumming between us. "We've never met," I said, taking the seat next to him. "But I know you. Quite well, actually." His expression shifted from confusion to guarded suspicion. "Is that so? And how exactly do you know me?" I leaned in a little closer, my voice low but firm. "I'm Ben," I said, letting the words hang in the air between us. "Peggy's husband." His face went pale, his drink frozen halfway to his lips. For a moment, he didn't say anything, just stared at me, his eyes wide, like a deer caught in the headlights. Then he set his glass down slowly, his hand trembling slightly. I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, trying to regain his composure. "I think you've got the wrong guy." I chuckled, a dark sound that surprised even me. "Come on, James," I said, my tone dripping with disdain. "Don't insult my intelligence. I know everything. I know about you and Peggy. I know about the hotel room, the late nights, the messages, everything." He swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the bar, looking for an escape. "Listen," he whispered, leaning in, his voice low and urgent. "This isn't the place to talk about this. I don't know what she told you, but—" I cut him off, my voice cold and sharp. "She didn't tell me anything. I saw it with my own eyes. I heard it with my own ears. And now I'm here, sitting in front of the man who thought he could take what's mine and get away with it." He flinched, his expression a mix of fear and defensiveness. "Look, I didn't know she was married. She never mentioned you, okay? I'm sorry. I really am." "Didn't know?" I hissed, my anger flaring. "Don't lie to me, James. You knew exactly who she was, and you didn't care. You knew she had a life, a husband, and you still decided to go after her. So don't stand here and pretend you're some innocent bystander." He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. I could see the panic in his eyes now, the realization that he was trapped, caught in a web of his own making. "I'm not here to talk, James," I continued, my voice low and menacing. "I'm here to make sure you understand what you've done, what you've taken from me. And I'm here to tell you that you're going to end it. Right here, right now." His face contorted with confusion and fear. "End what? I mean, if you're asking me to leave her alone, fine, I'll do it. I'll never see her again." I swear I leaned closer, my voice a harsh whisper. "Oh, you'll do more than that. You'll call her, and you'll end it tonight. Right now, in front of me. You'll tell her it's over, that you want nothing to do with her, and you'll mean it." He blinked, caught off guard. "Here? Now?" "Yes, now," I snapped, my patience wearing thin. "Or I'll make sure everyone here knows exactly what kind of man you are." He hesitated for a moment, then slowly reached for his phone, his hand shaking. I could see the sweat on his forehead, the fear in his eyes. He was trapped, and he knew it. I watched as he dialed her number, his voice unsteady as he spoke into the phone. "Peggy, it's me. We need to talk." He glanced at me, his eyes pleading, but I just stared back, unyielding. I can't see you anymore. It's over. I'm sorry, but it has to be this way." I listened as he stumbled through his words, trying to sound convincing, but there was no conviction in his voice. I could hear Peggy's muffled response on the other end, her voice sharp, confused, angry. I felt a surge of satisfaction, knowing she was getting a taste of the shock I had felt. When he finally hung up, he looked at me, his face pale and drawn. "It's done," he muttered. I told her. I nodded, a slow smile spreading across my face. "Good, but remember this, James. You stay away from her. If I see you near her again, if I even hear your name in her mouth, I will make your life hell. Do you understand me?" He nodded quickly, swallowing hard. Yeah, I get it. I'm sorry, man. I really am. I stood up, feeling a strange mix of triumph and emptiness. "I don't care if you're sorry," I said, turning to leave. "Just stay away from my wife." I walked out of the bar, the night air cool against my skin, my heart still pounding with adrenaline. I had forced his hand, but I knew this was far from over. Peggy would come home soon, full of questions, full of anger, and I would be waiting. Now it was time for the real confrontation, the one that would decide everything. I didn't have to wait long for Peggy to come home. I sat in the living room, lights dimmed, a glass of whiskey in my hand. The liquid swirled slowly as I stared into it, my mind churning with thoughts of what I'd just done, what I'd set in motion. I felt strangely calm, as if all the fury and confusion of the past few weeks had crystallized into a sharp, clear purpose. Tonight, I would finally get the answers I needed, one way or another. When I heard the sound of her key turning in the lock, my heart sped up, a cold, steady rhythm in my chest. I watched the door swing open, watched her step inside. Her face was tight, her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes sharp with something I couldn't quite place. She hadn't expected to see me sitting there, waiting for her. I saw her freeze for just a second, her gaze flickering over me, assessing, calculating. "Ben," she said, trying to sound casual, but I could hear the tension in her voice, the slight tremor beneath the surface. "What are you doing sitting in the dark?" I set my glass down slowly, leaning back in the chair, my eyes never leaving hers. "Just thinking," I replied calmly. "Waiting for you." She hesitated, then closed the door behind her, her hand lingering on the handle as if she were considering whether to turn back around and leave. But she didn't. She forced a smile, moving closer, her movements stiff, unnatural. "Is everything okay?" I chuckled, a sound that felt hollow in the silence of the room. "I don't know, Peggy. You tell me. Is everything okay?" She stopped a few feet away from me, her smile fading. "What's that supposed to mean?" she asked, her tone defensive, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Why are you talking like that?" I stood up slowly, taking a step toward her, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on my shoulders. "I think you know exactly what I mean," I said, my voice low, steady. "I just came from a little chat with James, your friend, your lover." Her face went white, her breath catching in her throat. I saw her blink, her lips parting as if she were about to say something, but no words came out. For a moment, the mask slipped, and I saw the panic, the fear. "James?" she repeated, a little too quickly, a little too loudly. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me, Peggy," I snapped, my patience snapping like a brittle twig. "I followed you. I saw you with him. I've seen the messages, the photos, I know everything." Her face flushed red, and she turned away, crossing her arms over her chest defensively. "So, you've been spying on me?" She shot back, her voice rising. "Invading my privacy? What the hell, Ben? That's sick." "Spying on you?" I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "You think I'm the one in the wrong here? You've been lying to me for months, sneaking around, fucking another man behind my back. And you're calling me sick?" She flinched at the word, her face twisting with anger and something else, guilt, maybe, or regret. I never meant for it to happen, she said, her voice breaking. I was lonely, Ben. You were always so busy with work, so distant. I felt like I was invisible to you. I felt a surge of rage flare up, hot and fierce. Don't you dare blame me for this, I spat. Don't you dare stand there and act like this is my fault. I was working to give us a good life, to make things better for us, and you repaid me by screwing some other guy? Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't care. I didn't feel sympathy or pity or even sorrow, just anger, burning like a fire that wouldn't be extinguished. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice trembling. I never wanted to hurt you, Ben. I needed something more, something I wasn't getting from you. I stepped closer, my eyes locked onto hers, my voice low and dangerous. You think you're the only one who's been hurt, Peggy? You think I don't know what it's like to feel alone, to feel like something's missing? But I didn't cheat. I didn't betray you. You did that all on your own. She wiped at her eyes, her hands trembling. I know I messed up. I was stupid. I got caught up in something I didn't even understand. I'm sorry, Ben. I really am. Sorry? I echoed, my voice dripping with contempt. Sorry doesn't cut it. You think you can just say sorry and everything will be okay? That we'll just go back to the way things were? She shook her head, her tears falling freely now. No, I know that. I know I can't fix this. But I love you. Ben. I still love you. I never stopped. I laughed again, the sound harsh and grating in the quiet room. Love? I sneered. You call this love? If this is your idea of love, then I want no part of it. She took a step closer, reaching out for me, but I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. Please, Ben, she pleaded. We can work through this. We can get help. We can… I cut her off, my voice sharp and final. No, Peggy, we can't. You made your choice. Now you have to live with it. For a moment, we just stood there, the space between us thick with tension, with all the things we couldn't say, all the wounds too deep to heal. I felt the last remnants of hope drain out of me, leaving nothing but a cold, hollow emptiness. She took a deep breath, her face a mask of sorrow and desperation. What are you going to do? She asked softly, almost a whisper. I looked at her, and for a moment I felt a flicker of pity, a tiny ember of the love we once had. But it was too little, too late. I don't know yet, I replied, my voice cold and detached. But I know one thing for sure. Nothing will ever be the same again. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her standing there, alone in the darkness. The silence stretched behind me like a long, unending road, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. I didn't know where I was going or what I would do next, but I knew one thing. This was just the beginning. I spent the next few days in a haze, drifting from one thought to the next, my mind replaying every word, every look, every moment of that final confrontation with Peggy. I felt like I was living in the aftermath of a storm, everything around me broken and scattered, but the air was clear, and I could finally breathe. I didn't know what to do or where to go, but one thing was certain. I couldn't stay here. Not in this house, not in this life we'd built on a foundation of lies. Peggy tried to reach out to me. She left messages on my phone, each one more desperate than the last. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I needed time, space, clarity. I needed to think. So I packed a bag and left, not knowing where I was headed, just knowing I had to get away. I drove for hours, the landscape blurring past me, my hands gripping the steering wheel like a lifeline. I found myself at the edge of the city, pulling into a small, nondescript motel, the kind of place where no one asks questions, where people come to disappear. I checked in, dropped my bag on the bed, and sat in the silence of the room, feeling the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on me. I stared at the walls, blank and dull, trying to make sense of the chaos in my mind. I thought about Peggy, about James, about all the nights I'd spent wondering, worrying, doubting. I thought about the life I'd imagined we'd have, the dreams we'd built together, now shattered into a million pieces. And I thought about myself, about the man I'd become, driven by anger and betrayal, consumed by a need for revenge. I felt a strange mix of emotions, grief, anger, relief. I knew I had to move on, but I didn't know how. I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, staring into the abyss, afraid to take the next step, unsure of what lay ahead. But as I sat there, I realized something. I had a choice. I could stay here, wallowing in my pain, letting it consume me, or I could start over. I could rebuild. I could find a way to heal. I didn't know where to begin, but I knew I had to start somewhere. So I picked up my phone, scrolling through the messages Peggy had left. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over her name, the memories flooding back, sharp and painful. But then I did something I hadn't expected. I hit delete. One by one, I erased every message, every call, every trace of her from my phone. I didn't need to hear her excuses, her apologies. I didn't need to hold on to the past. I turned off my phone and set it down, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders. I didn't have all the answers yet, but I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time, a spark of hope, a glimmer of possibility. I stood up, grabbed my bag, and walked out of the motel room, stepping into the cool night air. The city lights twinkled in the distance, and for the first time, I felt the pull of something new, something unknown. I didn't know where I was going or what lay ahead, but I knew one thing. I was done looking back. I was done letting the past define me. It was time to move forward, to find a new path, a new purpose. And with each step, I felt a little stronger, a little more certain, a little more free.